from a 10,000 foot view, right? We've got the fall, we've got the intervention, and then we've got a sermon. There's a certain strangeness to how complete this story is without having a ton of plot.
Preach it.
Grace by James Joyce from his Dubliners collection. Our penultimate recording we have as we move through the entire Dubliners collection.
That hurts my heart in so many ways you don't know. Oh.
I never knew the exact order we'd go through them, but I did know that the last two, Grace and the Ivy Day, I knew I'd be saving those for last. I'm curious if you know why, but all right. So let's just walk through this one. Usually we kind of do plot breakdown analysis. This one I thought might make sense just to kind of talk through as we move through the story.
Agreed.
But the opening, especially for a Dubliners, it's pretty grotesque, right? We've got a man who's fallen down the stairs, is face first in the filth of the floor, blood coming down the side of his cheek as men come out of the bathroom trying to help him up. This is definitely, like, it starts out super dark, and if we're jumping to the end, then it ends up like super bright religious at the end. It's definitely this upward hill, I would say, through the whole story.
Definitely a redemption story. I love the visuals here. It feels that very gothic, dark, not evil per se, but just gloomy and ominous, and you're just like, okay, this has got to get better, right? We're starting at the bottom and moving up, which is very unusual for, a lot of stories. A lot of plot devices start you kind of, midway, then they drop, and then you get redemption, drop again, and then end on the high note. Of course, you go through those peaks and valleys. It's almost kind of refreshing. And I know, big surprise, Crypto is thinking that, the bad stuff is refreshing to be at the beginning of a story, but I do.
Well, I find it interesting that you say it's a redemption story. We're going to have to parse out what that means with you here, because interestingly enough, there's a big wealth of information about James Joyce's life. When you read his diary, comes from his letters, right? And he'd write to his brother Stanislaus all the time. And one of the things that Stanislaus wrote about is that he kind of said that you could view this story as almost kind of like a mock, a humorous, a version of the Divine Comedy, right? Where the Divine Comedy had started out in the Inferno. Then you move into Purgatorio, where you're burning off your sins to ultimately end up in paradise, Paradiso, at the end. And you kind of have those three parts to this story as well.
I can see that. Very much this is a religious story with undertones, I guess, of alcoholism. But the forefront, I think, that Joyce was putting forth, in my opinion, is religion. And it's kind of hard, though. It's like sometimes it feels like he doesn't know which side to pick. So I'd like to get your take on that.
Do you think he highlights anything about inconsistencies when you say that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of perspective of how was religion being dealt with in Dublin during his life.
And I think we need to dive into that alcoholism too, right? Because you're like, okay, is this going to be like counterparts where you are the character a lot of times when you're walking through these, but this is the most omniscient and experimental, besides the dead, maybe that Dubliners gets. If counterparts was more about maturity in the mature section of this book, we are firmly at the end of public life. And, we don't spend a ton of life in Mr. Kernan. Like, we're not recreating counterparts as the alcoholic story. I think in this story, instead, we have the reverse picture, where we spend just as much time in other people's heads in terms of Mr. Power, in terms of Mr. McCoy, in terms of his wife, judging him. So in the same way that this is the finality of public life, so too do we see the finality of how public life judges the individual's choices.
And I'm just going to throw it out there as well. You use the word omniscient, right? That we're going through all these people's heads and having all these different perspectives and views. And it's a heavy religious tone. Religion, usually referring to God or a God, usually have some type of omniscient power to know all of all time, of all beings. Okay. I don't know.
Okay. I like it. Let's keep going with it. So people around the bar are just like, it's a scene, right? Whenever someone falls down, people want to see what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. Manager's kind of worried. So instead of calling the hospital, he calls the police.
Makes sense.
Get him out of here.
Yeah.
Constable
Who cares about his
comes.
well-being? We want to make sure there's no fights breaking out.
Okay, let's be honest. He's a good proprietor, right?
Yeah.
So the constable gets there, takes out his notebook. Who are you? Isn't getting answers. This is what I found hilarious is that they give the man some brandy and wakes right up. like that's the medicine that just gets him immediately like, oh, hey, well, I fall asleep.
Have you ever in your life known the hair of the dog to be more brandy? I mean, normally it's, a Bloody Mary, but woo.
I gotta say that the hair of the dog never worked for me.
Well, you're no Mr. Kernan then.
Well, let's start here. Who is Mr. Kernan, right? Do you think he's an alcoholic?
I hate that term, and it's so subjective of, well, what is an alcoholic? Is it because you think you're alcoholic or your friends think you're an alcoholic? How many drinks does it have to be? Does it affect your life? Does it affect your social life? I mean, yeah, this guy is laying down, piss drunk, bleeding, can't make coherent thoughts and tell people who he is, and he needs more alcohol to become coherent. I mean, I guess he is the epitome definition of an alcoholic, alcoholism, whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think you get some more information from the wife where she's like, oh, well, he's been drunk since Friday. And, Mr. Power, you're so nice. Usually all of his friends that help him out when he does this want money, implying that he does it before. So, like you said, it could be hard to throw around the big A word, but clearly, it is interfering with some type of personal life when your friends are trying to do some type of an intervention.
Agreed. Obviously, he has more issues than I think just alcoholism, but that's what he's turning to try to, quote, I guess, quiet his brain, for a lack of better terms, or what maybe would be acceptable for his time period.
Now, with that said, there is some nuance here because you'll notice that, in a bar, alcohol is a way to loosen the tongue, right? When we have this intervention in the next scene, you've got the missus bringing out 4 stouts. I think, enough stouts for everyone except him, right? And then even when Mr. Fogarty comes over, right, he brings over whiskey, a special glass or bottle of whiskey, right? Like there's something to be said about how, while alcohol is also, the devil's brew, it's a downfall to his life. You could see how it also is a social thing. It is a positive thing in some ways. And arguably, brandy is distilled wine. You have the religious discussion here about wine, the blood of Christ basically healing him. There's a more nuanced picture to alcohol, I would say, in this than there was in counterparts, at least.
You also think about it, too, is these people are all enabling him as well. I know that maybe we want to put a lot of emphasis on his alcoholism or his problem, or that Mr. Kernan is the bad guy of the story, quote, but these people are enabling him. If he wasn't given these things or, wasn't helped out, quote, by his friends, or, again, I don't want to place any blame on the wife because I think she's about the only good person in the story, then it probably wouldn't come to the point that it has.
Interesting. I want to talk about Miss Kernan. Let's start with Mr. Power, though, just because he's the one that shows up at the bar, if you remember, and he takes
he's the buddy,
Mr. Kernan home to Mrs. Kernan, right? So Mr. Power, tell me about him.
He's the young guy, I feel like, that represents the new age, or he's the one that represents the money and, quote, power that's rising up in Dublin at the time, and that he's trying to help the old make it home, help the old make it through this time period, is kind of how I got Mr. Power.
Do you find any meaning or humor in his name?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, Joyce wasn't pulling any punches. He's like, "Yep, this guy is Mr. Power." Like, all right, we're throwing it out there. No skirting around this.
Yeah, and you got it right on the head there. He was described as a much younger man, was employed in the Royal Irish Constabulary office in Dublin Castle, which for those that have been following along at this point know that Dublin Castle, seat of power by England, that whole division is run by English power, separate from the police force. So clearly representing kind of English power and selling out to it, I guess, in a sense too. But he was also a man, if you'll notice, cared more about how he was perceived than who he was. Right? He's almost kind of got like that politician-y feel of giving off on a certain appearance being more important than being, if you will. Like there's these quotes in here. It says, he had never been seen in the city without a silk hat of some decency and a pair of gaiters.
Do you think that it is coincidence or Joyce put them together so perfectly that their yin and yang of Kernan and power are kind of the opposite, where Kernan seems to, he's got to the point in his life, he just does not care what other people think about him. He can get sloppy junk. He doesn't care. And Powers, who that's the most important thing to him.
Is what people think of him. Oh, okay. I hadn't thought about the public life reflection, right? That's kind of what you're bringing up. That's interesting. Let's think about that. So he gets brought home to Mrs. Kiernan. And does Mr. Kiernan care what Mrs. Kiernan says? Does he care what his friends say? Nope. He doesn't seem to be too caught up in his own personal, view to that point. And Mrs. Kiernan, okay, who is she? Because, she's described as an active, practical woman of middle age.
And a very religious woman, yes?
Well, everybody's more religious compared to Mr. Kiernan, right? Because he was born Protestant, converted to Catholic, and he hasn't been back since. So he's clearly, I would argue he almost, when we talk about the 3 B's of religion, of belonging, behavior, and belief, he seems heavily more skewed towards the belonging side. I mean, a lot of Irish Catholics, Protestants were, where you belonged mattered. And there's even an element of nepotism there. Like when I was over in Ireland here recently, I went and toured the Cork City Jail. And there's even talks about how they made sure that it was passed down in terms of who ran the prison to someone who is Catholic. Like they didn't want a Protestant or anyone else running it. It had to be a Catholic person in charge of the jail. So there's an element of belonging that's important, I think, to a lot of Irish religion.
Do you think that Mr. Kernan's problem is that he's lost his belief, or he never had his belief to begin with? Because he seems to struggle with that. We see that, of him refusing to light the candle, for example, that he does belong in a roundabout way. I mean, they all sit around and BS about religion, even though it's so horrible and cringeworthy of how they get everything wrong. And obviously Joyce is kind of poking fun at, common people's understanding of a religion. And I think it's brilliant, but I feel like we don't have all the information, and that we're unjustly judging Mr. Kernan. And I know I'm kind of coming to his defense a lot, but I think that I got the feel that this is the point, is that he has this tragedy in his past, that he's lost his belief. And where do you go from there when you don't have that anymore, when you're at your middle age kind of, and you're trying to figure out where does the rest of my life go when it maybe hasn't worked out exactly how you feel it should have?
Well, I defend away, my friend. Do you think that a lot of these people have conflict with how they believe? Is that coming from us? Are we feeling that they need to behave a certain way? Right, because even you said Miss Kiernan was the most religious, but the narrative even said that she would believe in the Holy Ghost if pressed, that religion was a habit to her. There's a lot of words around belonging and habit. Mm. And, you brought up the point about the candles at the end. Well, if behavior mattered so much to them, then why is Mr. Kiernan bending so much of behavior to what fits his comfort level? You know what I mean? Like he's not willing to let go of his certain expectations of what right behavior is, which is going to be a problem for him when it comes to certain views and certain expectations for religion.
Right. I guess that kind of brings up the point of like when they're discussing the Jesuits, right? And I feel like Mr. Kernan was defending them and that he doesn't know. And it kind of comes back to your idea of belonging, right? Of he doesn't know where he fits in. He just knows that it's not in this box that he's supposed to be, that he feels like everybody else is in.
Well, 100%. They're bringing up the belonging as a weapon there. They're like trying to like glorify the Jesuits, right? Like they're the only branch that never reformed, and they bring up Pope 13 and you know, some of those, so some of them like kind of like were a little bit strange, and I looked it up and I'm like, okay, well, you mentioned earlier that they were kind of waffling back and forth. Well, there's a couple of inconsistencies in their stories and how they interpret certain things. And you're like, okay, is that a mistake? And I think with how many there are and how knowledgeable Joyce is, especially when it comes to Catholicism, it's probably not a mistake, right? These are probably meant to be, these characters are making mistakes. Like Joyce knows the answer, so he's specifically implanting the characters to misrepresent religion. And are they doing that to form their own needs? Or are they doing it because they're not actually believing and behaving the way that they're supposed to? They're more worried about the belonging of the church than the actual rituals and such. Like, oh, I'm not going to do the candle, not going to do the candle.
I also think it's this idea of peer pressure, even as far back as then, is that Dubliners are influencing one another, and that sometimes this misinformation as far back as 100 years ago is going to be moving around society and changing people's views and how Ireland is going to move forward together as a people. And I think Joyce is seeing that, you know, firsthand in Dublin.
So we talked a little bit about Mr. Power. How do I phrase this? That the visualizations are more important than the internal. Like, or things are not always as they seem, I guess might be another way of phrasing that. Do you feel the way that Mr. Kiernan tries to hide? Like if the beginning is the fall, the sin, the lecherousness that we're trying to cover up, and he's like, well, I can't really exactly remember who I was with. Oh, it was Mr. Hartford. Oh, you know, that usurious lending man who worked for Mr. Goldberg, right? Laying it on a little thick there. And he wants to kind of like quickly change the subject, right? He doesn't want to get too deep into what happened because I think he's trying to cover it up and present a different appearance. In the same way that, you know, when they were trying to do some of this intervention stuff, if you recall, Mr. Power was like, well, all's well ends well. Like he would just end it with one of these sayings as soon as things started to get uncomfortable. Almost like, we don't want to get too deep under the surface. Let's just stick to, you know, what looks nice and pretty on top.
Yeah, there's definitely a tonal shift towards the end of the story, which obviously is by design, like you said, because the beginning has such a dark, you know, tone, and then that softer tone shift at the end where, you know, everything's hunky dory. You know, we all made it to the end, you know, to the chocolate factory, Charlie. Everybody's okay. So yeah, it does feel that they're trying to put this brighter spin on religion, and I don't know. I feel like Joyce was starting to poke even more fun at the issues that religion is playing in Dublin.
I would 100% say that Joyce was poking at it because, you know, Joyce had a lot of the young Goodman Brown approach to, I think, religion in Dublin, where people presented, oh, I'm a good practice, you know, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, religious individual. But then you have the sin, you have the failure, and, you know, we know that man's going to fail. Like there's no one that lives a perfect life according to the Bible. But at the same time, I think Joyce found a lot of repulsion in the way that people would claim it, but not actually behave or believe, right? Like you have tons of that throughout this whole story about how people will claim to be something they're not. And as a result, they fail to actually improve their situation because they're more worried about appearances than actuality sometimes.
And we get to that idea at the end of appearances. The end of the story is, to me, comical, and maybe it wasn't supposed to be funny, but then you have it being preached as a businessman, and I felt like an accountant just fell into the story and was like, yep, JC was the best accountant ever, and he tallies the souls. And I'm just like, wait, what? And it feels so jovial compared to how like real and in the murk the whole story felt with this alcoholism and this belonging and this belief and this, real life that you see Mr. Kernan struggling with his faith and his friends and his family. And now suddenly this guy is cracking jokes about Jesus and counting the soul tallies. I'm just like, whoa, Joyce, you really pulled the rug underneath me at the end here. And it's a brilliant move because it sticks with you.
Yeah. So Father Purdon, do you know where we made a reference to it? I think very briefly in 2 Gallants. I think I mentioned this. Do you know where Purdon Street or what's on Purdon Street?
Really, really old church.
That, my friend, is the red light district in Dublin.
Oh,
or at least was. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm very wrong. My bad.
Yeah. So naming the priest after that street would definitely have been very clear as to what Joyce was doing here.
Oh, I love it. I'm glad you taught me that.
And the way that the priest is to your point, like, hey, businessman to businessman, right? Like there's this one quote. He said, he told his hearers that he was there that evening for no terrifying, no extravagant purpose, but as a man of the world speaking to his fellow men. He came to speak to businessmen, and he would speak to them in a businesslike way. If he might use the metaphor, he said he was their spiritual accountant, and he wished each and every one of them, to his hearers, to open his books, the books of his spiritual life, and see if they are tallied accurately with conscience. So
I just found that hilarious. I just found it so comical because, and I get it. I went to a Catholic school. I get that I had fathers, priests who were my teachers for science and accounting and everything else. But it just, to give this as a sermon just seems so disingenuous from a religious tone, I feel like. And it is comical. And I think it's genius by Joyce.
I think especially when you look at the sermon that he delivers here, where he talks about men being fallible, that, everybody's going to have struggles with life. And regardless of the humor and the tongue-in-cheek aspect, I think, reconciling where you are needing to improve is an important part about how you get out of the mire and the paralysis that I think a lot of Dubliners were experiencing, right? So by continuing to focus on the appearance of being the good person and the appearance of being, this great religious person, but you're constantly failing and not doing a good job of, whether you believe in religion or whether you just believe in do right, or the golden rule or Confucianism, whatever you want to believe in, that if you constantly focus on the appearance as opposed to the being, that's what causes, I think, some people's inability to move forward.
And do you think the story was strategically placed because at certain times of life, you will probably have that feeling more?
Well, if we look at the structure of Dubliners as a whole, it's 14 total stories plus the coda, which is the dead, right? So this is the end of all the stories, the end of the collection, kind of with the exception of the dead, and the end of public life, right? So if in the beginning, if you remember, it was the sisters, which is the little boy, right, who's dealing with life, learning about religion, learning about the structures being put onto him with Mr. Cotter and all that other stuff. Well, now we're at the end of life. And at the end of life is when you're going to be, I think, looking back on your life, both as a person consciously, but also if you believe in like that total recall of your life flashing before your life at the end of your life, which I do. I think that you're going to be forced to reckon with how did I live? And there's nothing you can do other than judge yourself. And maybe if you believe in religion, God's going to judge you as well. If you don't, I still think you're going to judge yourself. And that's where we end the story, with judging our wrongs, and our accounting in life is something that we're going to have to reconcile no matter what, I think.
That's a deep contemplation, right? Of all of your rights and wrongs. And again, we kind of talked about this. What does it mean of good or right or alcoholism. Is Mr. Kernan a bad guy because he's making poor choices? Is he neglecting his family? Is he neglecting his duty as a father? Is he neglecting his duty as a husband? Is he neglecting his duty as a friend, as a, quote, good Catholic boy? I mean, you could make an argument, yes, that he is. Does that mean that he's going to hell? Does that mean that he is judging himself harshly, too harshly, and that's why he's drinking? I think that he's a very complex character, and I think this story is probably relatable to a lot of us at different points in our life. We're going to contemplate the hard choices, the, quote, easy choices that we've had to make. And I just love how Joyce has given us this little tiny slice of life to view into Dubliners, but also to view into ourselves as well.
If you ain't struggling, you ain't living. I'll tell you that.
Agreed.
I reward and cherish the time spent diving into this. We probably have like 5.5, 6 hours of content on this. And if you guys have followed along and listened to some of these speeches, awesome. I'm so glad that you did. Feel free to, if you don't know what to say, leave a little, I don't know, like an angel icon. Is that appropriate for this story called Grace?
No, leave some type of icon. Little crying emoji being our penultimate episode on this, because I'm going to cry on the next one, because I want this to be one of those instances where I can unknow what I know so I can enjoy the journey again, because it's been truly eye-opening.
All right, guys. My name is Benuna. Peace.
Peace.